for being here, for listening here, and especially to Iwan and to Deborah for this invitation. So, on the morning of the 28th of July of 2015, in the dunes overlooking the shore of Puerto Madryn, the governor of Chubut, Martin Bussi, addressed the audience attending one of the main events encompassing the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the first Welsh settlers to Patagonia. In his speech, he emphasized the importance of this event, stating that the settlers' democratic spirit and their sense of justice represented the foundations of the province. But the main topic addressed by Bussi was their peaceful and productive relationship with the indigenous people, which he considered as the inception of what he called the DNA of Chubut. Despite this, the scale of the celebrations reflected a hegemony that Welsh Patagonian history and culture holds when talking about the provincial past. This recent example allows us to inquire about the role that Welsh colonizations played in the ways Chubut's past has been narrated through time, and in the ways it has been publicly and politically used. Ever since Jürgen Habermas proposed to pay attention to the public uses of the past, this perspective of study has become inescapable when thinking about the role of history and historians in the public sphere, especially when it comes to building a past that identifies any political entity, be it a nation or, as in this case, a province. Historians have been active in what Hobsbawm and Ranger have called the invention of tradition, aimed at establishing a common cultural foundation for these imagined communities. At the same time, Benedetto Croce argues that all history is contemporary history and therefore read from the present, implying that these interpretations will change over time. These readings of the past are also constructed over time, and they become collectively shared, forming a historical consciousness, which is produced and reproduced in multiple ways. In this way, the state plays a central role in this articulation through education, museums, public speeches, celebrations, public holidays, tributes, cultural industry, or tourism. But it's not the only one, as other social, individual, or collective actors also participate actively. Therefore, the aim of this lecture is to analyze the role given to the history of the Welsh settlement within the official narratives of Chubut's past, and how they change over time, throughout three periods that we will cover. The first one will be the 1930s, which circumscribed to the last stage of the national territory of Chubut. The second one will be the first 15 years of its provincial period, from 1958 to the early 1970s. And third, the years between the celebration of the 150th anniversary in 2015 and today. Moving on to the first one, the 1920s saw a resurgence in the national interest on Patagonia. The workers' strikes in Santa Cruz in 1921 alerted nationalist circles of the need to control these so-called frontier territories, which were defined by strong working-class populations and a scarce presence of the state. And this was seen as a place for entry for potential enemies of the state. So the Argentinization of its inhabitants became a priority for the national government. Navarro Floria and Núñez argue that these ideas reflected a project of internal colonialism within the nation. And although the territory had already been occupied with people, the political, imaginary, and discursive frontiers still had to be won. In addition, Barros states that the populations of the territories were considered politically immature and in need of tutorship, therefore unable to govern themselves. In fact, the citizens of the national territories enjoyed limited political rights, as they could only elect their local authorities, while the governors were appointed by the president. But by this time, a series of voices began to emerge from the territories, demanding a greater state presence while also paying attention to the Patagonian reality. And this paved the way for an idea of a territorial identity within Patagonia. And a way of achieving this was by focusing on the historical aspects of such places. In the case of Chubut, we take into account two writers whose works we consider fundamental in creating a historical discourse of the period. The first one is Orestes Trespailier, who published a book in 1930. Trespailier was a professor who was born in Buenos Aires and came to Patagonia and to Chubut in particular in the 1920s as a teacher, since education was considered one of the constructing tools of nationality. He settled in Trelew and became a professor and a local historian. He spoke at celebrations like Guillermo, as Geraldine shows in one of her papers, and published articles in the Spanish section of Dravot, as Walter Brooks also shown in one of his papers. As well as other newspapers and journals, he also wrote some books covering different aspects of Chubut history. And overall, his works represent an effort to show the advance of civilization and progress over barbarism. One of such books was this book in particular, Historia del Chubut, History of Chubut from 1930, which was the first book and the first effort to narrate the past of Chubut into a single text. This idea of a master narrative, if you wish, of the entire territory. First, he describes the natural elements of Chubut, as well as the indigenous peoples, more or less together into one large chapter, which was typical of the ways of writing and reading the indigenous peoples in those days, circumscribed to nature, right? As well as some European expedition. And then he started working on the Welsh settlement, dedicating 20 of the 67 pages of the book to this topic. He talks about the preparations and negotiations for the journey, the arrival of the first settlers to this promised land, and the pilgrimage to the Chubut Valley, as well as the first encounter with the Tehuelches. However, the key actor in Trespailier's narrative is the state, and he focuses on the conflicts between the state and the Welsh settlers, first by showing the dissatisfaction with the authorities, especially with Commissar Fino Quieto, and then describing the conflict between them over the Sunday drills, in a point where Trespailier clearly sides with the authorities. Although the Welsh are presented as virtuous and industrious individuals, he constantly warns of their reluctance to become Argentine subjects, mentioning their attempts to achieve self-government, as well as their request to even become a British protectorate. He therefore considered President Roca's visit to Wladfa in 1900 as a warning to the need to, he says, break the Welsh wall, establishing the colony of Chubut by injecting new blood from other nationalities. And then he describes them as people who did not know Spanish and saw any outsider as a possible invader. Thus, the Welsh project is represented as an obstruction to the consolidation of an Argentine identity, but one that was managed to be neutralized through the action of the state. Still, the Welsh are considered as the agents of national sovereignty in Chubut because mainly of their role in the 1902 referendum of Comhefrits. The cooperative spirit is also highlighted as a driving force behind their development, their economic development. Yet, when comparing the Welsh with the Boer settlers in the south, and the quote is on the slide, basically because of their religion and their use of exotic languages on our land, he also notices that patriarchal, he says, the two currents brought their leader chieftains, and this is the reason why the Chubut masses urgently need to have someone to follow, and this is the cause for the visible absence of a spirit of frank and determined personal action. Thus reflecting the discourse of the political immaturity we previously mentioned. He also considered both groups as central to the settlement of Chubut, although he doubted of their ability to govern themselves. Thus, only the Argentine state can guarantee their own survival, according to Trespailier. The second book is a biography, which was a usual topic in order to narrate the history of the nation in a sort of embodiment through these great men, basically. So in this way, when considering the history of Chubut, it's not surprising that one of the books dedicated to this particular place in this particular period is Lorenzo Amacha's book Fontana El Territoriano, sorry. Amacha was a lawyer born in Tucumán who settled in Esquel in the 1910s, and he became a key figure in the local society as president of the local rural society, as a representative for the national territories in Buenos Aires, where basically he defended the interests of the land-owning elite. Basically, he was a landowner as well in Esquel. Amacha presents Fontana, the first governor of Chubut, as a soldier, a statesman, a scientist, as a naturalist, and is described as a new Spartan with simplicity truly worthy of a hero of Plutarch. After covering his activities in Chaco in the north, he addresses Fontana experiences in Chubut, presenting an extensive narrative of the history of Wladfa. The settlers are described as nationalists and inspired by American democracy, which they embrace as a reaction to the oppressive English regime, and also as fiercely religious, albeit Protestant people. The hardworking spirit and morality are admired by the author, as well as their adaptations to the new environment, and describing their irrigation networks as a true miracle. Yet, just like Trespaglier, Amaja presents the arrival of the national government to the settlement as a prevailing need in order to domesticate its new inhabitants, who pretended a degree of autonomy. Amaja reinforces this need for domestication and Argentinization by quoting various government agents in the last quarter of the 19th century, such as Francisco Moreno or Eugenio Telo, which was the second governor of Chubut. And these quotes present the Welsh settlers as isolationists that lack any feeling of Argentine nationality, who refuse to speak Spanish, consider themselves as English subjects, and only request the presence of the Argentine state in times of need. He also shows the dangers of the claims for autonomy have brought on the settlement, isolation and misery. So the Welsh are described as a community that shuns at any kind of acceptance of sovereignty by the Argentine state, and such refusal affects their own growth and development. And this is where Amaja presents the figure of Fontana as someone capable of uniting the interests of settlers and those of the state, since, I quote, "No one knew how to better understand and weigh the multiple moral values of that laborious community than Governor Fontana himself." So for Amaja, Fontana is the one who manages to capitalize the virtues of the Welsh settlers and matching their aspirations with those of the state by approving and leading, basically, the expedition to the Andes, the famous Refleros del Chubut. He recounts how the settlers were eager to undertake the expedition, but that they needed an authority figure to lead it, a task that, of course, fell to Fontana. Again, there is a need to control and take care of the settlers of their own impulses, their own immaturity. Later on, he describes how the Welsh tried to stay in the river, for example, in the river Senger and search for gold, but, I quote, "Fontana's firm will to continue with the expedition prevailed." He also rescued the disciplined character of the Welsh, and he considers that the Fontana expedition consolidated the definitive sense of the Welsh of belonging to Argentina, and points out that settling in Comhefrid, and especially the 1902 referendum, as the moment when they finally became pure Argentine citizens. While the historical narratives of the territorial period include the Welsh settlers as one important action of the process, they were not the central one, as we've seen. They needed to be domesticated. They were something of a matter of concern from the state. However, this was changed with the creation of the province of Chubut in 1955. In 1957, 2 years later, the provincial constitution was written and approved by an assembly. On the first day they met, a series of tributes were paid. The first one was to the writers of the National Constitution of 1853. The second one was to those who died during the liberating revolution of 1955, thus inscribing the current assembly within the political opposition that overthrew Peron. And finally, it was requested that the tribute be extended to the first Welsh settlers who arrived at Port Madryn in 1855, as well as other immigration flows that carried out the conquest of Chubut and carried out its development with work, faith, and patriotism. So while the three elements can be considered as a possibility for the foundations of the province and the writing of the constitution, it also implies certain alternatives to be domesticated. The first one, about the 1853 constitution, domesticated this national fragmentation prior to this moment. The 1955 coup that eliminated Peronism basically domesticated Peronism within Argentine society. And of course, the Welsh domesticated the landscape and the indigenous peoples through work, faith, and patriotism. So we find the first difference between this discourse, between the territorial discourse and this new provincial discourse, as the Welsh already having been domesticated by the state, are now seen as enforcers of nationality and civilization. But the Welsh colonization had another central role in the history of the Constitution, in the writing of the Constitution, sorry. It was the main argument to keep the provincial capital in Rawson instead of Comodoro Rivadavia or Esquel, precisely because the Chubut Valley was defined as the location of history. Moving on, the discourse continued through the practices of the first provincial government elected in 1958, which rapidly became aware of the need to establish an official narrative of Chubut's past, which was done through different means, such as monuments, celebrations, publications covering historical topics, and the creation of the first provincial holiday. Just 2 months after taking office, the Assembly passed a law declaring the 20th of July, the Gweliglaniad, as its first public holiday, thus inaugurating a civic calendar in Chubut. And this was an achievement for the Welsh community, who had long since been pushing for this recognition, despite their own contradictions. On the first day of the law, of the discussion of the Assembly, Congressman Ferrari proposed once again a tribute be made to the Welsh settlers. And in his speech, he linked the Welsh project with the advancement of state sovereignty in Patagonia, defining the settlers as those who populated these lands and gave us a new reality for our developing motherland. Another congressman joined the tribute, highlighting the importance of this fact. And I'm talking about the courageous culture and industrious contingent that made the link between the civilized centers and the Patagonia desert. Therefore, as we can see in these quotes, right, and this way, basically, the Welsh are given the role of settling the state before the state even arrives. Thus, the Welsh are not only as enforcers of national sovereignty in the territory, but also, as we can see in the second quote, they considered as the fulfillment of the Spanish colonial project, of which Argentina considers itself as a natural heir. Finally, the autonomy of the provincial government is linked to the autonomous project of the Welsh. And therefore, in this way, the past acquires a new meaning, as provincial autonomy was now understood as the fulfillment of the Welsh dream of self-government, supported by its founding fathers, a dream that was interrupted and rendered impossible by the Argentine state. If that topic, the topic of self-government, raised concerns toward the Welsh settlers in the territorial period, now it became the cornerstone of the province. The Provincial Department of Culture was another institution dedicated to narrate Chubut's past in this period. Its first director was Virgilio Zampini, who was strongly connected to the Welsh community. In a 2003 interview, he stated that one of the department's main actions during this first government aimed at the strengthening of our cultural consciousness in the basis of Chubut's identity. The department will publish a number of magazines and journals. However, when writing on historical topics, the focus will almost exclusively be on Welsh colonization. First, through a magazine called First Pages of History of Chubut, first issue in 1958, as you can see on the left, which I happened to find at the National Library of Wales, searching between Guillermo Williams' papers. And it consisted of a prologue and an article titled A Chapter in the History of Chubut, which was written by the aforementioned Orestes Espaillet, which was, of course, devoted entirely to the history of the Welsh settlement. This subject was revisited in 1961 in a book titled Semblance and Evocation of the Welsh Feet in Chubut, written by Francis Evelyn Roberts and Tegay Roberts, with other collaborators. Unlike the text of the territorial period, the Welsh are now the main actor, and the state is a secondary actor. And the conflict that develops regarding self-government is read from the point of view of the Welsh, describing, for example, the performance of Commissioner Murga as despotic. But beyond this episode, the text presents a harmonious and conflict-free narrative, emphasizing the hardships suffered by the settlers and the subsequent economic, social, political, and cultural success of the Wladfa. Likewise, it once again recognizes that the definitive settlement of the Welsh in Chubut is an accomplishment that the Spanish colonizers of the colonial period failed to achieve. The second administration, the provincial government made by Roque Gonzalez, who was elected in 1963, continued with the task of building symbols and meanings. In 1964, the Assembly approved the design of the provincial coat of arms, which combined elements of modern industrial development, represented by the Florentino Ameghino Dam on the Chubut, with a spike of wheat, a symbol of Welsh agricultural work. However, we wonder, this coat of arms celebrated the industrial future of Chubut, but it also appeared to commemorate a seemingly bygone era of Wladfa, that one of an agricultural paradise. Indeed, since the 1930s, as Fernando has probably better than I had explained, the situation of the community had changed significantly. The bankruptcy of the CMC, the nationalization of the irrigation company, and the impossibility to compete against cereal production in Buenos Aires had reduced the economic role of the community and the valley. In addition, the Welsh had become an ethnic minority within the province, having received many migrants from Europe, Asia, neighboring countries, as well for the rest of the country. This reality, added to the proximity of the centenary of the Welsh settlement, triggered a memorialistic effervescence. As Pierre Nora affirms, social groups developed the need to establish discourses, sites, and marks of remembrance when facing the threat of forgetfulness. Added to this was a renewed interest in Wales regarding Wladfa, which strengthened, of course, the ties between both communities. So the 100th anniversary of Wladfa managed to merge the interests of the Welsh community as well as other sectors of the Chubut society with the political will of the provincial government to consolidate the arrival of the Welsh settlers as the cornerstone of the province. And indeed, the 1955 activities managed to achieve this. They compromised several activities that took place throughout the year in Argentina and in Wales. In Chubut, they included the visit of President Arturo Illia, representatives of the British government, at the arrival of visitors from Wales, collectively known as the Pilgrims. Magazines or books were published, radio and television programs were produced and broadcast, several conferences covering the history of Chubut and the Welsh settlement took place, with speakers such as Luis Feldman Josin, who was a media businessman and former teacher who helped organize the celebrations, or Virgilio Zampini, or Francis Evelyn Roberts. Monuments such as the one in Puerto Madryn were erected, and even the steadfast was revived and celebrated ever since. However, the speeches given by Governor Roque Gonzalez and President Illia on the Gwillig Laniad provided a new angle to understand the importance of the celebration, as they focused on the peaceful and productive relationship between the indigenous people and Welsh settlers. This novel approach to the past, embedded in a policy that promoted growth through industrialization, presented this coexistence as the basis for the economic and social development of Chubut. This discourse was further legitimized by the presence of members of indigenous communities. In this picture, you can see Illia and Roque Gonzalez with one of the members of the indigenous communities. And also by laying the foundations of a monument dedicated to the Tehuelches, located a few meters away from the landing site of the Welsh. However, the 1966 coup d'etat will bring authoritarian governments which will restore conservative ways of reading and writing Chubut's past. In this way, amidst this new political climate, a board of historical studies of Chubut was constituted. Its objective was, of course, to consolidate an official narration of the provincial past destined both for the province and for the nation. Its members were from Chubut, Buenos Aires, and other provinces of Patagonia, and few of them were actually academic historians, and none of them from Chubut. Mostly were writers, teachers, priests, journalists, or members of the armed forces. There were members of the Welsh community, such as Emma Hughes and Francis Evelyn Roberts, although they didn't present any papers in this books nor Congress. So the board held a conference of regional history, and 16 papers which were presented, which were later on published in these journals of the history of Chubut. And basically this conference and these journals showed that both the history of the Welsh settlement, but also the presence of the Spanish colonial project and the Catholic presence through the priests that accompanied the military in the conquest on the desert and then established themselves in Rawson and the rest of Chubut are the two main elements of Chubut's history. And of course, the indigenous people are totally erased from this narrative. The Board of Historical Studies was operated between 1967 and 1971 until its chairman, Luis Feldman Hossin, who we also previously mentioned, died. And Virgilio Zampini continued to publish under the title of the board through articles, cultural brochures, or tourist guides. And in 1975, he published a small book called Chubut, Brief History of a Province, where he structures a chronology of Chubut history that will become widespread, once again, presenting the Welsh settlement as a civilizing force that constructed Chubut. And since the 1970s, the history of Chubut became a subject in primary education, becoming another area where this official narrative of the past was reproduced, especially considering that Virgilio Zampini was in charge of outlining its curriculum. However, Welsh culture in Patagonia was considered to be in a steady decline, as Rhiannon showed through Irma Hughes' quotes yesterday. Chubut celebrated Wladfa's past as the foundations of the province, but not in its present way. This began to change as Welsh culture became part of Chubut's cultural heritage, with certain elements and experiences such as the chapels or the tea houses and the Welsh tea will become a key attraction for cultural tourism in Chubut, which is a phenomenon that reached a high point in the mid-90s, as this picture clearly shows. The new political situation in Wales also renewed an interest in between both communities, which started, of course, a cultural exchange that continues to this day. And the beginning of the 21st century further celebrated this Welsh community with the creation of a second provincial holiday that commemorated the 1902 referendum of Cwm Hefyd. Thus we arrived to the 21st century, and the 150th anniversary renewed the arrival and the closeness to that date. We found a renewed interest in the history of the Welsh settlement, attracting academic and non-academic researchers from Chubut, from other provinces, from Wales, and from the rest of the world. And the Foro of Puerto Madryn became a central space where all these narratives and approaches coexisted and coexist. We also find multiple productions, from articles in specialized journals to popular history books, which are intended to disseminate the history of the Welsh settlement, and at a national and regional level, but also for the consumption of the Welsh community itself. And it's curious that although these popular history books, usually consumed by the Welsh community and the rest of the national community, if you wish, and the provincial, usually reproduce more traditional narratives of the Welsh settlement, aligned with those we've so far analyzed through this lecture. Is it perhaps a resistance to open to new perspectives and interpretations of the past? Perhaps, as ultimately these productions help reinforce the sense of community within these descendants, but while also consolidating the status of their own heritage in the formation of the province. Also, the proximity of the celebration awaked a new memorialistic effervescence in the Welsh community of Chubut, which once again gained the support of the provincial and national governments to back the celebrations, as well as the support of the Welsh government. Like 50 years before, multiple activities took place, but on a considerably larger scale. Many monuments were erected throughout the province, concerts, plays, and other artistic performances were held, documentaries and film produced, as well as a considerable amount of historical research, most of it published with some government support as part of the Biblioteca Tegay Roberts of the 150th anniversary. And the Gwilym festivities continue with a series of events and practices already established in recent years as traditions, such as the reenactment of the landing with a reception committee formed by representatives of the indigenous communities. And the government embraced this narrative of the past, considering this peaceful relationship between these brothers in the desert as a founding moment for a multiculturalism that defines what Governor Bussi described firstly as the DNA of Chubut. Bussi's discourse aimed at the building of an identity in a province considered to be fragmented, and this celebration, of course, provided the perfect stage for it. Again, this was legitimized by the presence of the indigenous communities in these celebrations. As we can see in the picture on the right, Angel Ñaco, the Lonco of the Mapuche Tehuelche community in Puerto Madryn, gave the opening speech. And he highlighted the positive attitude of the provincial government towards the indigenous communities. But the festivities also represented a dispute over the purpose and the meanings of the celebration to the many groups involved in it, particularly to the Welsh community, who perceived it as a political appropriation of their past, something the presence of different political leaders, trade unionists, political supporters, and the ultimately cancelled visit of President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner only helped fuel. Yet the magnitude of the festivities showed that the role of the Welsh settlement and the Welsh colonization continues to have an hegemonic presence in the reading of provincial past, as well as the confirmation of Chubut's culture. So to conclude, we've seen how the role of the Welsh settlement has undergone transformations in the narration of the Chubut's past. The most significant occurs in the transition between national territory and province. The narratives of the territorial period stated that the Welsh operated as an outpost of civilization, but were also represented as a community to be domesticated by the national government. The state, through commissioners, governors, and even presidential visits, managed to do so. And this was crowned with a referendum of Cum Hevrit. They were celebrated as industrial subjects, but they needed to be governed and introduce new ways of Argentine nationality. This representation changes significantly in the provincial period, as this new political autonomy is understood as an achievement of the Welsh emancipatory ideal. The festive calendar, symbols, and institutional tributes raise them as the central actors in the foundation of Chubut. The celebration of 1965 furthers this view, while considering the peaceful coexistence between indigenous and Welsh as the main factor of provincial growth, as a discourse that will be definitely consolidated in the celebrations of 2015. Today, however, Bussi's narrative and the state narrative of multi-ethnic province feels like a distant memory, as the context has changed significantly in Chubut. The apparent Chubut harmony of 2015 has been supplanted by a context of economic and social crisis, with land ownership once again becoming a central issue. Despite having been discredited by the academics of despite having been discredited by academics, the nationalist discourses that label the Mapuches as foreigners re-emerge and legitimize the state policies of eviction and criminalization of the indigenous peoples, while reinforcing the discourse of the pioneers as builders and of nationality and provinciality. The Welsh community is at the center of this dispute of meanings, and the positive relationship with indigenous people is still celebrated, but just as a thing of the past. Therefore, returning to Croce's affirmation that all history is contemporary history, the work of historians, especially those who live and work in Chubut, must be critical. And I mean critical in the two possible words and in the two possible meanings of the word. First, it must be gaining a greater place in the public discussions on the provincial past, but it also must propose some critical views, emphasizing that Chubut history is traversed by colonial logic and that the Welsh settlers were one of their integral parts. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Thank you very much for Guillermo for that fascinating and wide-ranging lecture, and yet another perspective on Wladfa. Are there any questions? I'm sure there are. Okay, I can see Fernando and Lucy. I'm not sure which one of you were first. Lucy, would you like to go first?
I was just saying to Fernando that he should go ahead, but
ladies first.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Guillermo. I found that incredibly rich. I've been scribbling down. So I really hope that this is published as well, because there's so much in there, and it traverses so much history and so many fantastic sources there. If you don't mind, I'd quite like to ask two questions. The first one is about these amazing books written by Orestes Trespaile and Lorenzo Amagia. What kind of impact did they have on sort of the imaginary of Chubut in Buenos Aires? Did they have a wide impact, and did they help to really shape sort of popular opinion in many ways about and interpret Wladfa for ordinary people? You know, what sort of thing was that impact? And then another thing that I wanted to say was just a comment, really, I suppose, about multiculturalism in Argentina, and this attempt by the Argentine state to say multiculturalism is here, therefore we recognize it's a settler colony, but now everything's sorted out now, everything's settled, everything's dealt with. Do you think that in that required both the indigenous people and the Welsh people to be sort of relegated to the past as a kind of like, done, that's sorted? So I'd just like you to reflect on the kind of multiculturalism a little bit that you did later.
Thank you for the questions, Lucy. Regarding the first one, yes, these books, especially the one of Amagia, had a big impact because Amagia was part of these nationalist circles, and actually the book was like printed in a limited print, but with very high quality, and they provided illustrations by a famous like traditionalist illustrator from Buenos Aires. So it was a bit of a like collection item, if you wish. They were numbered and signed by him, and when the Board of Historical Studies republish it, like in a very low quality, just like a pamphlet, if you wish, they also provide some reviews and comments from readers, and most of the readers are like far-right nationalist Catholic members of the Buenos Aires elite, like founding members of the Patriotic League, which the Argentine people might know what that is, but it was like a reactionary conservative movement, right? And they all like basically celebrate the book. They say that this is like the new foundation of Chubut and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I think it has a very important impact in the circles that were thinking on Patagonia from Buenos Aires, all these intellectuals that I was referring previous. So yeah, it was, for me, it was very interesting, and for them as well. I mean, and also, the people from the Board of Historical Studies consider Amagia as it's like the founder of provincial historiography. Actually, Amagia is the honorary chairman of the board, and he's part of that particular congress. But also, I couldn't expand on this because of time, basically. But Amagia was the architect of an eviction of a community in Esquel, the Nahuelpan community, in 1937, and which was like a few years later in the 1940s government was part of that land was reversed to the indigenous populations. So he uses the 1967 Congress to denounce this vile, the vile way in which the government took his lands and put it into like an unproductive community. So it's like very interesting. Yeah, it's really amazing. And actually, in my PhD thesis, I have a whole chapter on this board, and for reasons of time, I had to cut. And Tres Baillier is a bit more of a mystery. I first found Tres Baillier in the writings of Geraldine and Walter, and then by chance at the National Library of the Ministry of Education, I found the book, which was incomplete. Then a friend from Trelew found the whole book in the Agustín Álvarez book library in Trelew. Then I found that he had many publications. So I guess he was a public figure in Trelew. I also found him in another book on politics in Trelew in the 1930s. And he was like he wrote articles in newspapers. He was a socialist. And so it was quite an interesting subject, I guess. I really want to like delve into his biography. I actually even talked to one of his descendants to see if they have any archives. And also he writes in 1958, he died shortly afterwards, but it's like the first words of provincial history are written by him. And then about multiculturalism, well, I think it's super interesting. And I think there's a big gap between discourse and practice, right? Like you can always say something and show something like in the 150th anniversary, and you can always have somebody say something for you, like the Lonco, for example, but then many other Mapuche Tabols's community will not agree with what Angel Ñanco would say. And I think that like the change, I think the political, economic, social change in Chubut, the shift was like so unimaginable from 2015 to now. Like I can hardly, you believe it. I don't know. For example, my mom was a teacher, so she's retired, like a provincial pension, and like one of the things that was typical of Chubut was they always pay the workers of the province in time, and all of that has changed. Now the debt is like the main thing. And also, as I said in the paper, the land ownership is like everything shifts, like the discourse shifts to land ownership is the new subject into question, which also reflects the national government of the period. Like Macri's Argentina was this, like construction of enemies, construction of alterities, construction of Peronism as an alterity, and the indigenous more or less in the same terms as Peronism. So yeah, I think it's like, that's a big, for me, that's the big problem with these discourses of multiculturalism, as well as the one from like heritage, for example, which I mentioned very briefly, but like what do we consider heritage? What don't we consider heritage? Who says what heritage is? And that's the way that also multiculturalism is displayed in a way, like through what is important and what isn't. And as Geraldine says, extractivism. So land in its many forms and uses and ownerships are the central basis as that. And the indigenous communities also refer to that, not just like these usurpations or whatever, but also the mining and stuff. So yeah, thank you very much.